You think a janitor belongs on the floor? Then watch carefully, because before this trial is over, the only person everyone will trust is the one holding the mop. The heavy oak doors of Jefferson County Courthouse swung open just after 8 o'clock on a cool Monday morning in downtown Atlanta, and lawyers in tailored navy and charcoal suits streamed through the marble entrance carrying leather briefcases, polished confidence, and the quiet certainty that they controlled every word spoken inside Courtroom 7. The scent of fresh coffee drifted through the hallway, blending with furniture polish and the faint chemical smell of freshly cleaned stone floors. Naomi Brooks guided her mop bucket across the corridor with practiced precision, her gray maintenance uniform crisp despite the early hour, her name stitched neatly above her heart in fading blue thread. She moved carefully around clusters of attorneys without asking them to step aside. Years of working before sunrise had taught her that most people in expensive shoes never notice the person cleaning beneath their feet. She simply smiled whenever someone accidentally crossed the path she had just polished and quietly started over without complaint. As she approached the courtroom entrance, voices echoed from inside. A high-profile corporate fraud case had attracted reporters, law students, and nearly every attorney in the building. Television cameras waited beyond the security checkpoint, while journalists whispered predictions about another effortless victory for Richard Sullivan, one of the state's most celebrated trial lawyers. His reputation stretched far beyond Georgia. Colleagues admired his flawless record, clients paid extraordinary fees for his confidence, and younger attorneys studied recordings of his courtroom performances like championship athletes reviewing game footage. Richard believed the courtroom belonged to him long before any judge entered. He stepped through the doors wearing a perfectly fitted dark blue suit, a silver watch catching the morning light as though even time answered to him. Conversation stopped when he walked past. Assistants hurried behind him carrying thick binders, stacked with exhibits. Without slowing down, Richard glanced toward the freshly polished floor where Naomi was replacing a caution sign near the counsel tables. His expression tightened with irritation. One polished shoe had picked up a tiny streak of moisture no larger than a postage stamp. He looked down, sighed dramatically, then deliberately scraped the sole across the marble before pointing toward it with the end of a legal folder. "Well," he said loudly enough for reporters, clerks, and waiting jurors to hear. "At least someone here knows what their real job is." A few uneasy chuckles floated through the room. Naomi looked up calmly, offering the same polite expression she gave everyone. "Good morning, sir," she said softly. Richard ignored the greeting. Instead, he slid the folder from his arm and allowed it to fall onto the polished floor beside her cleaning cart. Papers remained neatly inside, but the gesture was unmistakably intentional. "Since you're already down there," he said with a smug smile, "pick that up too. That's what cleaners are for." Silence spread through the courtroom faster than any objection. Even the reporters stopped typing. Naomi lowered her eyes toward the folder for only a moment, then bent gracefully, lifted it with both hands, brushed away a nearly invisible speck of dust, and held it out with quiet dignity. "Here you are, counselor," she said. Richard took it without gratitude, straightened his tie, and smirked as though he had proven something far more important than authority. Around him, several people looked away, uncomfortable but unwilling to challenge the city's most powerful attorney. Naomi simply returned to her mop, her movements steady, her breathing unshaken, while sunlight poured through the courtroom windows and reflected across the spotless marble floor, revealing that sometimes the strongest person in the room was the one everyone had already decided not to see. The quiet that followed lingered only for a few seconds before the machinery of the courthouse resumed its rhythm. Bailiffs adjusted their uniforms, clerks organized stacks of exhibits, reporters whispered into their phones, and attorneys hurried to claim the best seats before the hearing officially began. Within moments, it was as though nothing unusual had happened at all. That was the way people survived uncomfortable moments. They buried them beneath routine. Naomi Brooks wheeled her cleaning cart away from the courtroom entrance and continued down the long marble hallway lined with framed photographs of former judges whose solemn faces watched over generations of legal battles. The polished floors reflected the morning sunlight pouring through 30-foot windows, creating ribbons of gold that stretched beneath her worn black work shoes. She slowed near each courtroom door, checking every brass handle for fingerprints, every bench for forgotten coffee cups, every corner for scraps of paper that others considered too insignificant to notice. She had learned years ago that details always mattered, even when people did not. Every weekday began the same way. Her alarm sounded at 4:30 in the morning. She left her modest apartment before dawn with a travel mug of black coffee, drove 22 miles through nearly empty streets, and unlocked the courthouse maintenance office before most of the city had finished sleeping. She never complained about the schedule because the job had given her something she valued more than comfort. It had given her stability. After her mother became seriously ill several years earlier, Naomi had quietly stepped away from a career that had once filled conference rooms instead of courthouse hallways. Most people assumed she had spent her entire life cleaning buildings. She never corrected them. Assumptions required less energy than explanations. The maintenance supervisor often joked that Naomi knew the courthouse better than the architects who had designed it. She remembered which courtroom thermostat drifted 3 degrees too cold every winter, which hallway echoed loud enough to interrupt witness testimony, and which elevators paused exactly 6 seconds longer on the 4th floor. She also knew something almost nobody else realized. Every courtroom told a story long before anyone spoke under oath. She could often sense the tension simply by watching attorneys organize their files, noticing how witnesses held their hands, or hearing the silence that settled over a jury before opening statements. Years earlier, she had learned to read evidence with the same careful attention she now gave polished marble and spotless glass. That habit had never disappeared. As she passed the evidence preparation room, 2 young law clerks struggled to balance oversized bankers' boxes filled with financial records. One folder slipped sideways, scattering several printed spreadsheets across a nearby table. Naomi instinctively glanced toward the pages while helping steady the box. Columns of numbers, transaction summaries, audit references, and highlighted account transfers flashed before her eyes for only a heartbeat. Yet something about the formatting felt strangely familiar. She did not stop walking. She simply tucked the observation into the quiet corner of her mind, where she stored countless details every day. Inside Courtroom 7, Richard Sullivan's confident voice rose above the growing crowd as he rehearsed portions of his opening statement with an associate. Through the partially open doorway, Naomi could hear him emphasizing phrases like financial certainty, irrefutable evidence, and expert analysis. His words echoed confidently across the polished chamber. She continued wiping fingerprints from the courtroom doors without looking inside, but the cadence of those arguments stirred memories she had spent years trying to leave behind. Memories of conference tables covered with spreadsheets, late nights reviewing forensic reports, and colleagues debating decimal points that could change the outcome of multimillion-dollar cases. She took one slow breath, folded the cleaning cloth neatly into her cart, and reminded herself that those days belonged to another chapter of her life. Even so, as the courtroom clock approached 9 o'clock and the first spectators settled into the gallery, an uneasy feeling refused to leave her. Somewhere inside that mountain of financial documents, something did not fit, and although nobody else seemed to notice, Naomi could already feel that the smallest overlooked detail often carried the greatest truth. Judge Eleanor Whitmore entered precisely at 9 o'clock, and the entire courtroom rose in respectful silence. Her black robe moved with quiet authority as she took her seat beneath the state seal, her calm expression revealing nothing about what she expected from the day ahead. She had spent more than 2 decades on the bench and had earned a reputation for rewarding preparation instead of performance. She rarely interrupted attorneys, but she noticed everything. Every hesitation, every exaggerated claim, every glance exchanged across the courtroom. As everyone settled back into their seats, Richard Sullivan stood with effortless confidence, buttoned his jacket, and approached the center of the courtroom as though he were stepping onto a familiar stage. His polished voice filled the chamber without needing to rise above conversation. Jurors watched him closely. Reporters leaned forward with pens ready. Richard understood attention better than most people understood evidence. He had built an extraordinary career by making complicated financial disputes sound simple enough for anyone to believe. He smiled at the jury with practiced warmth before turning toward the opposing counsel, who quietly reviewed notes without returning the gesture. Richard enjoyed moments like this because they reinforced the image he had carefully constructed over many years. He was the attorney clients hired when losing was not an option. Outside the courtroom, younger lawyers often waited for an opportunity to shake his hand or ask for career advice. Inside the courtroom, they studied every sentence he spoke, hoping confidence itself could become a legal strategy. He believed success belonged to people willing to seize it, and somewhere along that journey, he had convinced himself that intelligence and status always traveled together. To Richard, expensive suits suggested competence, executive titles implied wisdom, and maintenance uniforms represented people whose opinions existed outside the boundaries of serious conversation. That belief had become so deeply rooted that he no longer questioned it. While the clerk organized exhibits, Richard reviewed several enlarged financial charts. Displayed beside the witness stand, colored lines traced millions of dollars moving between corporate accounts. Every figure appeared carefully labeled. Every calculation seemed precise. His associate whispered that the visual presentations looked perfect. Richard nodded without checking them again. He trusted the experts his firm had hired, and even more than that, he trusted his own reputation. Across the courtroom, Naomi quietly emptied a small trash container near the rear entrance after receiving permission from the bailiff to finish her morning duties before testimony began. She stayed well outside the proceedings, moving silently enough that few people noticed she was there at all. As she tied the trash liner closed, her eyes drifted once more toward the financial display board. This time she paused for only the briefest instant. One percentage printed near the center of the chart pulled at her attention like a single wrong note in an otherwise perfect song. The calculation looked ordinary to everyone else, but something about the sequence connecting two account summaries felt impossible. She lowered her eyes and continued working without revealing even the smallest reaction. Nearby, two reporters quietly discussed Richard's impressive courtroom record. One remarked that the trial was practically over before it had begun because nobody ever outmaneuvered him in complex financial litigation. Another agreed, saying the defense would probably settle before the week ended. Richard overheard the conversation and allowed himself a satisfied smile. Confidence settled over him as comfortably as his tailored jacket. At the opposite end of the room, Judge Whitmore observed the attorneys preparing their materials while occasionally glancing toward the gallery. Her attention briefly rested on Naomi, who carefully straightened a chair that had been pushed slightly out of line before guiding her cleaning cart toward the exit. The judge watched for another second before returning her focus to the bench. Nothing seemed unusual, yet experience had taught her that truth often entered a courtroom wearing ordinary clothes. As the clerk officially called the case to order and the first exhibit appeared before the jury, Naomi quietly reached the hallway outside the courtroom. She stopped beside the closed door for a single breath. Inside, Richard Sullivan began explaining numbers that sounded flawless. Outside, Naomi felt the uneasy certainty growing stronger. The figures were polished as carefully as the marble floors she had spent all morning cleaning. But beneath their perfect surface, one critical mistake was waiting for someone willing to see it. The first witness spent nearly 40 minutes explaining balance sheets, corporate transfers, and accounting procedures that sounded convincing enough to satisfy everyone in the courtroom. Richard Sullivan guided the testimony with polished confidence, leading each answer exactly where he wanted it to go. The jurors nodded as charts appeared on large display screens, arrows connecting one transaction to another in neat blue lines. Every figure seemed to reinforce the same conclusion. Every explanation appeared carefully rehearsed. Even the opposing counsel seemed frustrated by how smoothly the presentation unfolded. Outside the courtroom doors, Naomi Brooks continued polishing the brass railings along the hallway, but the voices drifting through the partially opened entrance reached her with surprising clarity. Years of studying financial evidence had trained her ears almost as much as her eyes. Certain phrases immediately caught her attention. Deferred revenue, asset reclassification, quarter-end adjustments. Then Richard confidently referred to a percentage printed on Exhibit 24. Naomi stopped moving for just a second. Her fingers tightened around the soft cleaning cloth. That percentage was impossible. She had noticed it earlier on the display board, but now, hearing it described aloud, she understood exactly why it felt wrong. The witness was comparing two reporting periods that had been calculated under completely different accounting standards. The numbers looked consistent only because someone had applied the same ratio to datasets that should never have been measured together. It was the kind of mistake that could remain invisible to almost everyone in the room, yet completely changed the meaning of the evidence. Naomi quietly closed her eyes for one slow breath. She wanted to convince herself she had misunderstood. She mentally reconstructed the calculations from memory, recalling every column she had glimpsed only briefly that morning. The answer remained exactly the same. The conclusion being presented to the jury rested on a flawed comparison. If no one recognized the error, an entire case could move in the wrong direction. She looked through the narrow glass window beside the courtroom door. Richard spoke with absolute certainty, occasionally smiling toward the jury as though every sentence carried the weight of undeniable truth. The expert witness confidently agreed with each question. Nobody challenged the exhibit. Nobody hesitated. Naomi felt the familiar conflict she had buried years ago rising inside her once again. Her current responsibility was simple: keep the courthouse clean, stay invisible, go home after her shift. Yet another responsibility, one that had shaped much of her earlier life, refused to remain silent. Facts mattered. Accuracy mattered. Justice depended on details that most people overlooked. She pushed her cleaning cart toward the clerk's office, her footsteps almost soundless across the polished stone floor. Court clerk Melissa Harper was organizing additional exhibits for the afternoon session when Naomi gently knocked on the open doorway. Melissa looked up with a friendly smile. They had worked in the same building for years. "Everything all right, Naomi?" she asked. Naomi hesitated, choosing every word carefully. "I do not want to interrupt the proceedings," she said quietly, "but I believe there may be an error in one of the financial exhibits being presented to the jury." Melissa blinked in surprise. "An error?" Naomi nodded once. "I could certainly be mistaken, but the percentage on Exhibit 24 appears to compare reporting periods that should not be measured together. If that is correct, the conclusion changes." Melissa's expression shifted from curiosity to uncertainty. Before she could respond, another voice entered the room. Richard Sullivan had stepped into the hallway during a brief recess to retrieve additional documents. Hearing the final sentence, he slowly turned toward Naomi with a look of amused disbelief. Several attorneys nearby also paused their conversations. The hallway suddenly felt much quieter than before. Richard gave a short laugh that echoed against the marble walls. "Are you telling me," he said with unmistakable sarcasm, "that the cleaning staff has started auditing courtroom evidence now?" Naomi remained completely calm. She lowered her hands to her sides and answered with quiet respect. "No, sir. I am only saying that if there is even a small possibility the calculation is incorrect, someone should verify it before the jury relies on it." Richard's smile widened, but this time it carried something colder than confidence. Around them, conversation stopped as more people turned to watch what would happen next. The smile on Richard Sullivan's face spread slowly, not because he found the situation amusing, but because he believed everyone around him was about to witness another effortless demonstration of his authority. He looked at Melissa Harper, then back at Naomi Brooks, as though the very suggestion deserved applause for its absurdity. Several associates standing nearby exchanged uncertain glances, while two reporters quietly drifted closer, sensing that an unexpected confrontation was unfolding outside the courtroom. Richard folded his arms and tilted his head. "Tell me," he said loudly enough for everyone in the hallway to hear, "where exactly did you receive your accounting education? Between waxing these floors and emptying trash cans?" A few uncomfortable laughs broke the silence. Nobody laughed with genuine amusement. They laughed because Richard Sullivan had spoken, and years of watching powerful people control every room had taught them that silence could sometimes carry a price. Naomi did not react. Her expression remained composed, almost peaceful. She looked directly at Richard without hostility. "I am not trying to challenge you, sir," she answered softly. "I only believe the calculation deserves another review." Richard gave a dismissive wave of his hand. "Believe," he replied. "Courtrooms do not run on beliefs. They run on qualifications, credentials, and expertise. You are part of the maintenance staff. Stay within your lane." His words echoed across the marble corridor. Melissa shifted uneasily, clearly regretting that the conversation had taken this direction. Perhaps we could simply verify the exhibit, she suggested carefully. Richard turned toward her before she could finish. Verify it, he interrupted. Do you have any idea how many certified forensic accountants reviewed these numbers before they entered this courtroom? Every figure has already been examined by professionals. He paused, then deliberately looked back toward Naomi. Not by someone pushing a mop. The hallway became painfully quiet. Naomi lowered her eyes for only a brief moment, not from embarrassment, but from restraint. She understood that anger would only reinforce every assumption Richard already held about her. She took one slow breath before speaking again. If I am mistaken, then reviewing the calculation will only confirm your presentation. Richard laughed again, shaking his head as though speaking to an unreasonable child. You still do not understand. He stepped a little closer, keeping a respectful distance, but making sure everyone could hear every word. People earn the right to speak in this courtroom. They spend decades studying law, finance, and evidence. You cannot simply walk in from the hallway wearing a maintenance uniform and expect serious professionals to question their work because you have a feeling. The remark settled heavily over the group. Naomi remained still, her hands folded lightly around the handle of her cleaning cart. Her heartbeat quickened, yet her voice never changed. It is not a feeling, she replied. It is a mathematical inconsistency. Richard's expression hardened. Enough. His tone was no longer playful. The next time you think you belong in a legal discussion, remind yourself why you were hired here in the first place. Several people looked down at the polished floor, unwilling to meet Naomi's eyes. Others quietly returned to their conversations, pretending they had not heard any of it. The moment passed with the uncomfortable speed that often follows public humiliation. Melissa opened her mouth as though to apologize, but Naomi gently offered a reassuring smile before she could speak. It is all right, Naomi said. I should get back to work. She slowly turned her cart and walked away down the long hallway. The soft wheels rolled almost silently across the shining marble, leaving behind only the faint scent of fresh lemon polish. Richard adjusted his jacket, collected his folders, and confidently returned to courtroom 7 without looking back. To him, the interruption had already been forgotten. Another insignificant distraction had been removed before it could disturb his carefully prepared case. But high above the courtroom entrance, from the narrow window of her private chambers, Judge Eleanor Whitmore had witnessed far more of the exchange than anyone realized. She had not heard every word, yet she had seen Richard's dismissive gestures, Naomi's remarkable composure, and something else that caught her attention even more. Through all the ridicule, Naomi had never once defended her pride. She had defended only the numbers. And that quiet difference stayed with the judge long after the courtroom doors closed once again. Naomi Brooks guided her cleaning cart toward the oldest corridor in the courthouse, a quiet passage that connected the historic law library to a row of empty hearing rooms rarely used outside special proceedings. The noise from courtroom 7 slowly faded behind thick limestone walls until only the soft squeak of the cart's wheels and the distant hum of the building's ventilation system remained. Morning sunlight streamed through tall arched windows, stretching long rectangles of warm light across the polished marble floor she had finished only minutes earlier. Dust floated gently through the golden beams before disappearing into stillness. Naomi stopped beside one of the windows and rested both hands on the smooth wooden handle of her mop. For the first time that morning, she allowed herself a slow, steady breath. She was not angry. She had experienced dismissive words before. She had lived long enough to understand that prejudice often revealed more about the speaker than the person being judged. What unsettled her was something far heavier than wounded pride. Somewhere inside that courtroom, 12 jurors were listening to numbers that could shape another person's future, and one mathematical error had quietly slipped past every experienced professional in the room. She closed her eyes for a brief moment and mentally reconstructed the exhibit again. The percentages, the reporting periods, the account classifications. Every figure returned in perfect sequence. The conclusion remained unchanged. The calculation was still wrong. A faint ticking sound echoed from an antique courthouse clock mounted high above the hallway entrance. Each second seemed louder than the last. Naomi looked through the window toward the city beyond. Downtown Atlanta had fully awakened. Cars flowed steadily along the streets below. Office workers hurried across intersections carrying briefcases and coffee cups, each person absorbed in responsibilities invisible to everyone else. She wondered how many lives quietly depended on people choosing honesty over convenience. Her thoughts drifted back several years to another courtroom in another city, where she had once spent entire days explaining financial evidence to judges and juries. She remembered the responsibility that came with every opinion she offered. A single overlooked decimal point could alter millions of dollars. One incorrect assumption could change someone's reputation forever. Back then she had promised herself that evidence deserved loyalty above ego. That promise had never left her, even after her career had. She reached into the pocket of her maintenance uniform and unfolded a small, worn photograph. It showed Naomi standing beside her mother on the front porch of their modest home, both smiling beneath bright summer sunshine. Her mother's gentle words echoed in memory with remarkable clarity. "Character is what remains after nobody applauds." Naomi smiled softly before returning the photograph to her pocket. She picked up the mop again and continued working, the damp cotton fibers gliding smoothly across the cool stone floor in slow, even strokes. The repetitive motion steadied her thoughts. She reminded herself that she had done what conscience required. Whether anyone listened was no longer within her control. At that very moment, inside her private chambers overlooking the courthouse courtyard, Judge Eleanor Whitmore sat alone at her desk reviewing notes from the morning session before the afternoon testimony resumed. She reached for the exhibit list almost absent-mindedly, but her attention lingered on one entry longer than expected. Exhibit 24. She remembered Naomi's calm expression in the hallway. Not defensive, not emotional, simply certain. The judge tapped her pen lightly against the desk, then opened the evidence binder to the page containing the disputed financial chart. Her experienced eyes moved slowly across the columns. One figure caught her attention, then another. She frowned slightly and reached for a calculator resting beside a stack of legal briefs. Outside, the courthouse remained wrapped in quiet afternoon light, while inside, numbers that had appeared unquestionable only an hour earlier began revealing a different story to the one person whose responsibility was not merely to hear arguments, but to search patiently for the truth hidden beneath them. When the afternoon session resumed, the atmosphere inside courtroom 7 felt subtly different, though nobody could explain why. Sunlight had shifted across the tall windows, casting longer beams over the polished wood benches and the American flag standing beside the judge's bench. Jurors settled back into their seats with quiet anticipation, while reporters reopened notebooks that had already begun filling with confident predictions about the outcome of the case. Richard Sullivan walked to counsel table wearing the same relaxed smile that had followed him through every successful trial of his career. He adjusted his tie, exchanged a few quiet remarks with his associate, and glanced confidently toward the jury. Nothing in the room suggested that the afternoon would be any different from the morning. Judge Eleanor Whitmore entered with her usual calm expression, yet those who knew her well noticed one small difference. A thick evidence binder rested beside her gavel, marked with several handwritten notes attached by yellow tabs. After the courtroom was called to order, Richard stood to continue his presentation. He had barely spoken 2 sentences before the judge gently raised one hand. "Counselor Sullivan," she said evenly, "before we proceed, the court has several questions regarding Exhibit 24. Richard smiled politely. "Of course, Your Honor." The judge lowered her eyes to the financial chart before looking back at him. "Would you please explain how the percentage on page 12 compares reporting periods prepared under different accounting standards?" Richard's confident expression barely changed. He answered smoothly, repeating nearly the same explanation he had offered earlier. The judge listened without interruption. When he finished, she quietly entered several numbers into the calculator beside her bench. The silence that followed seemed unusually long. Finally, she looked toward the expert witness seated nearby. "Can you independently verify this calculation?" she asked. The witness adjusted his glasses, reviewed the exhibit again, and hesitated. 1 second passed, then another. The certainty that had filled the courtroom all morning slowly began to dissolve. "Your Honor," he admitted carefully, "I would need additional time to review the underlying methodology." A ripple of quiet whispers moved through the gallery. Richard's associate leaned toward him, speaking in a voice too low for anyone else to hear. Richard quickly examined the exhibit himself, his eyes moving faster with every passing moment. For the first time that day, uncertainty appeared across his face. Judge Whitmore closed the binder with deliberate calm. "There is another matter," she said. "Earlier today, an individual informed court staff that this calculation might contain a mathematical inconsistency before this issue was raised by either legal team or the expert witness." Richard immediately straightened. "Your Honor, with respect, I do not believe hallway speculation should become part of these proceedings." The judge met his eyes without changing her expression. "Neither do I, Counselor, which is precisely why I verified the figures personally before addressing the court." Another long silence settled across the room. Then Judge Whitmore turned toward the courtroom deputy. "Please ask Ms. Naomi Brooks to come into the courtroom." Confused murmurs spread through the gallery. A few moments later, the rear doors opened quietly. Naomi stepped inside wearing the same gray maintenance uniform she had worn all morning, one hand still lightly holding the folded cleaning cloth she had forgotten to place back on her cart. She looked surprised, almost hesitant, as every face in the courtroom turned toward her. Richard stared in complete disbelief. Judge Whitmore offered Naomi a calm, respectful nod. "Ms. Brooks," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent courtroom, "before today's proceedings began, you recognized a flaw in Exhibit 24 that escaped every attorney, every consultant, and the court's own expert review. I would like you to approach the witness stand." Naomi remained still for a heartbeat, unsure she had heard correctly. The judge continued, "The court has also confirmed your professional history. Before joining the courthouse maintenance staff, you served for more than 12 years as a certified forensic accounting specialist whose published analytical framework is cited in several financial litigation references currently used by this court." No one moved. Reporters lowered their pens. Jurors exchanged astonished glances. Richard Sullivan slowly looked from the judge to Naomi, then back again, as the certainty he had carried all day quietly disappeared beneath the undeniable weight of the truth. Naomi Brooks slowly walked toward the witness stand, each quiet footstep echoing across the silent courtroom. Her gray maintenance uniform stood in striking contrast to the tailored suits surrounding her. Yet for the first time that day, nobody noticed the uniform before noticing the woman wearing it. Judge Eleanor Whitmore waited patiently until Naomi was seated before speaking. "Ms. Brooks," she said warmly, "the court understands you are no longer practicing professionally, but would you be willing to explain the concern you identified?" Naomi nodded respectfully. "Yes, Your Honor." The courtroom deputy handed her a laser pointer while the financial exhibit appeared once again on the large display screen. Naomi stood without hesitation, though her voice remained calm and unhurried. She pointed toward the highlighted percentage that had drawn her attention hours earlier. "The calculation itself is accurate," she began, "but it answers the wrong question." Several jurors leaned forward. Even Richard Sullivan remained completely still. Naomi continued, "This percentage compares two reporting periods prepared under different accounting standards. The numbers appear compatible because they share similar labels, but the underlying classifications changed after the reporting transition. When those categories are treated as identical, the resulting percentage creates a misleading conclusion." She moved the pointer slightly lower on the chart. "If the data is normalized using the proper reporting framework, the transfer pattern changes significantly." Judge Whitmore nodded. "Can you demonstrate that for the court?" Naomi smiled politely. "Yes, Your Honor." The courtroom clerk provided a legal pad and calculator. Naomi carefully wrote several figures exactly as they appeared in the exhibit, explaining each adjustment one step at a time without rushing or using unnecessarily technical language. Her explanation remained remarkably clear, allowing everyone in the courtroom to follow the calculations. Within minutes, the revised percentage appeared. A noticeable murmur spread through the gallery. The conclusion supporting the central argument had changed completely. The certified expert witness requested permission to review Naomi's calculations. Judge Whitmore approved. After several careful minutes, he looked up from the documents and slowly removed his glasses. "Your Honor," he said honestly, "Ms. Brooks is correct. I did not recognize that the reporting standards shifted between the two periods. Her methodology is accurate." Silence settled over the courtroom once again, but this time it carried admiration instead of discomfort. Richard stared at the revised exhibit without speaking. The confidence that had defined him throughout the trial had quietly given way to reflection. He looked toward Naomi, who simply returned to her seat without any expression of triumph. She had not embarrassed him. She had not criticized him. She had corrected the evidence and stopped. Judge Whitmore folded her hands. "The purpose of this courtroom is not to reward pride," she said calmly. "Its purpose is to discover the truth. Today, truth arrived from a source many people failed to recognize." Her words lingered throughout the room. Richard slowly rose from his chair. For several long seconds, he seemed unable to find the right words. Finally, he faced Naomi directly. "Ms. Brooks," he said quietly, "I owe you an apology." Every reporter immediately lifted a pen. Richard continued without looking away. "This morning, I judged your value by your uniform instead of your character. I dismissed your knowledge before I was willing to hear it. I was wrong." Naomi met his eyes with the same calm expression she had carried throughout the day. "Thank you," she replied gently. "We all overlook things sometimes. That is why evidence deserves another look before people deserve another judgment." Richard lowered his head slightly, accepting her words without argument. Judge Whitmore offered a faint smile that reflected both relief and respect. Around the courtroom, attorneys who had ignored Naomi only hours earlier now regarded her with quiet admiration. Nobody applauded. Nobody celebrated. They simply understood that they had witnessed something far greater than a corrected calculation. They had witnessed humility restoring justice where certainty alone had nearly led it astray. The courtroom slowly emptied as the afternoon sun settled lower over downtown Atlanta, washing the courthouse windows with a warm amber glow that softened the sharp lines of stone and glass. Reporters hurried outside to file stories that none of them had expected to write that morning. Attorneys gathered in quiet conversations, no longer discussing strategy, but reflecting on the lesson they had just witnessed. Jurors left with thoughtful expressions, carrying home more than facts about a financial dispute. They carried the memory of a woman whose quiet integrity had spoken louder than any polished argument. Naomi Brooks remained inside only long enough to return the legal pad and calculator to the courtroom clerk. Melissa Harper smiled as she accepted them. "Thank you," she said sincerely. Naomi answered with the same gentle smile she had offered at the beginning of the day. "You are welcome." There was no celebration in her voice because she had never come looking for recognition. She simply picked up the folded cleaning cloth she had placed beside the witness stand and walked toward the hallway, where her maintenance cart still waited exactly where she had left it hours earlier. The courthouse looked almost unchanged, yet everything felt different. People who had passed by her without a glance that morning now paused to greet her. A young law student held open a heavy wooden door. A bailiff nodded respectfully as she passed. Even several attorneys who had overheard the confrontation earlier quietly stepped aside, allowing Naomi to continue without interruption. None of them seemed quite sure what to say, and somehow silence felt more meaningful than rehearsed compliments. At the far end of the hallway, Richard Sullivan stood alone beside one of the tall courthouse windows, his briefcase resting on the marble floor. The confidence that had always seemed inseparable from him had given way to something quieter and far more genuine. As Naomi approached with her cleaning cart, he reached down before she could. Resting beside the wheel was a small microfiber cloth that had slipped unnoticed onto the floor. Richard picked it up carefully, brushed away an invisible speck of dust, and extended it toward her with both hands. "I believe this belongs to you," he said. Naomi accepted it with a grateful nod. "Thank you." Neither of them hurried to fill the silence that followed. Outside the window, late afternoon sunlight reflected from nearby buildings, casting shimmering patterns across the polished courthouse floor. Richard looked toward the courtroom doors before speaking one final time. "I spent years believing respect followed titles," he admitted quietly. "Today I learned it follows character." Naomi smiled with quiet kindness. "Then today was valuable for both of us." She gave a small nod and continued walking. Richard remained where he stood, watching as her maintenance cart rolled slowly down the long corridor. The soft sound of its wheels echoed gently against the marble walls before fading into stillness. Judge Eleanor Whitmore happened to step from her chambers just in time to see Naomi disappear around the corner. She paused for a moment, then looked toward the bronze plaque mounted beside the entrance to courtroom 7. Beneath the engraved words, "Equal Justice Under Law," the afternoon light reflected so brightly that the letters seemed almost alive. No speeches followed. No cameras remained. No applause interrupted the quiet. There was only a woman in a gray maintenance uniform finishing the last few minutes of her shift with the same care she had shown at the beginning of the day, wiping fingerprints from a brass handrail until it reflected the evening light like polished gold. Some victories announce themselves with loud celebrations. Others leave behind only silence, a cleaner hallway, a humbled heart, and the quiet certainty that dignity never depends on the clothes a person wears, but on the truth they choose to protect when nobody expects them to matter.